What is a Hong Kong film? This is a scene from The Killer, a Hong Kong action film from 1989 by legendary director John Woo. Even if you've never seen this movie, you've definitely seen its style. Extreme slow-mo, birds flying, two-handed gunning. These all started with him. But when you think of Hong Kong cinema, you might think about Wong Kar Wai's love stories of hopeless romantics, like the cop who buys cans of pineapple to get over his breakup. Most people forget that John Woo's films, with their gangsters, bloodshed, and toxic masculinity, are as much a product of Hong Kong. Both directors took part in a nationwide search for Hong Kong's identity through their own unique perspectives. In this video, I want to focus on what John Woo brings to the table by looking at The Killer. On the surface, John Woo's film about a killer and a cop working together to defeat the triad might seem like just a fun action flick.
You don't owe me nothing. This is the gift of friendship.
But its localized conflict is deeply ingrained in Hong Kong's anxieties from the time. To understand the significance of The Killer as a cultural artifact, we must go all the way back to 1961. A young man named Lee Jun-fan studied philosophy at the University of Washington. He became interested in Descartes and Hume, but it was the call of the French existentialists to embrace the exciting anxiety of freedom that made him reflect on his real existence in the world. His mind wandered to the memories of growing up in Hong Kong, how he was held back, expelled, and sent to reform school, how he would roam the alleys of Kowloon looking for street fights, and how he misguidedly learned Kung Fu, not to better himself, but to be better than everyone else. He went to America to avoid his past, but he was trying to be a person he could never be. He thought to himself, wouldn't I be so much happier if I lived a life my ancestors would be proud of, studying the art of Kung Fu rather than this Western philosophy? You probably know him better by his English name, Bruce Lee, as the man who brought Hong Kong culture to Hollywood, the world's biggest stage. In the US, he became a cultural phenomenon, launching a martial arts craze and shattering stereotypes plaguing Chinese Americans. But in Hong Kong, he became culture itself. His superstardom made cinema one of Hong Kong's biggest exports. But this glory was short-lived. Bruce Lee died at the age of 32. The president of the Bruce Lee fan club said that because his death was less than glorious, many felt deceived and betrayed. They felt empty because of the loss of an icon. While the world mourned the late actor, Hong Kongers felt a sense of numbness. How could a star who burned so bright fizzle out in such a blaze of nothingness? He was Hong Kong's only international superstar, the only shot they had to gain cultural power across the harbor. So when he died, the optimism audiences and filmmakers once had died with him, and part of Hong Kong's identity went into crisis. You see, Hong Kong's recent history had been one of turmoil. It was colonized by Britain in 1841, who imposed its culture, then occupied by Japan for 3 years during World War II, which was a traumatic period for the country. Then after that, a surge of Chinese refugees entered, drastically changing its demographics and culture. Throughout all of this, Hong Kong had been like a toy being tossed around from owner to owner, but never given its own agency. Bruce Lee represented the ability for Hong Kong to break out of this cycle and reach freedom, as his films always showed him beating enemies who were larger in size and greater in number. John Woo too was inspired by Bruce Lee. He was born in Guangzhou, China, and his earliest memories were of the Chinese Civil War. He watched as his family got persecuted for being Protestants, which forced them to move to Hong Kong. But he didn't find freedom here either. His family lived in slums, only to find their neighborhood swallowed by flames. He turned to Western media for any semblance of freedom, and particularly loved watching American Westerns. He imagined himself as a cowboy, never burdened by the past, always drifting around from location to location. But in 1971, everything changed for Wu when he watched Bruce Lee's film, The Big Boss.
Cabron, I need to see you a boss.
Alongside millions of Hong Kongers, he saw Bruce Lee fighting his way through the ranks of a drug smuggling ring to confront its leader as the ultimate Hong Kong fantasy. To beat the Big Boss, be it Britain, Japan, or China, and find freedom in self-determination in a way that was uniquely Hong Kong. By the 80s, Hong Kong's international economy was flourishing, and the end of the turbulent Cultural Revolution in China represented a calm after the storm. For better or for worse, Hong Kong became content with its colonial situation. But unbeknownst to everyone, this period of normalcy would not last very long. 1984. The Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed, confirming that in 1997, Hong Kong would be returned to China. This caused widespread cultural paranoia. The China Hong Kong had once been a part of was unrecognizable. It would be like if you saw a friend you haven't seen since kindergarten, if that friend had a warlord face.
You're goddamn right.
Ackbar Abbas, a Hong Kong-born postcolonial scholar, wrote, "Now faced with the uncomfortable possibility of an alien identity about to be imposed on it from China, Hong Kong is experiencing a kind of last-minute collective search for a more definite identity. In other words, Hong Kong was scrambling to define its own culture. Not quite Chinese, but also not just British either." But the people of Hong Kong weren't alone. The handover became an international issue, and Hong Kong became a popular location for sci-fi movies, representing a city that existed out of time. You might have heard of Hong Kong 97, which, let's just say, has a cult following. It's a Japanese video game from 1995 where you play as Bruce Lee's cousin, for copyright purposes of course, and try to kill the entire population of China. Yeesh. The final boss is the zombified Deng Xiaoping, the then leader of China. He wasn't even dead at the time. The movie industry especially played a big role during this time. Many films from this era, coined the Hong Kong New Wave, gained widespread critical success. By 1989, John Woo found himself in the middle of this movement. The Hong Kong New Wave, unlike many other film movements, is not defined by a common style. Rather, the movement is defined by filmmakers experimenting with style in order to find one that fits in the cultural attitudes of the country during this tumultuous period. You might immediately think of Wong Kar Wai's movies, whose characters react to the impending handover with sadness and longing. In contrast, John Woo's characters react to the threat of change with anger. The killer's opening scene illustrates this. Jeff, the killer, begrudgingly takes his final job. Let me reword that. The killer, who is named Jeff, begrudgingly takes his final job to kill a bunch of gangsters cooped up at a traditional Chinese nightclub. As he enters the nightclub, guns blazing, he's the mirror image of Bruce Lee, walking into a room full of bad guys and taking everyone out. But this becomes a logistical nightmare. As he kills the gang's boss, he accidentally blinds Jenny, a young nightclub singer, inciting the rest of the film's chaotic chain of events. He feels indebted to Jenny and takes another job to pay for her eye transplant, which leads him to being chased by a detective, ending up in a shootout where he has to drive a child to the hospital and his contractor doesn't pay him for his job. Wait a minute, isn't that wage theft? There's a clear shift from the optimism of Bruce Lee's kung fu movies to the pessimism of John Woo's gun fu movies, one that stems from anxieties of the handover. Bruce Lee's films have a very optimistic outlook towards action and deal with the very black and white ideas of justice. His movies usually begin with a crime organization or a rival gang causing some sort of injustice, which Bruce Lee then sets out to fight, using his fists and the power of kung fu. John Woo's movies, by contrast, treat violence much less idealistically. The lines between good and bad are blurred, replaced by messy political conflicts between law enforcement agencies, triads, and everything in between. Whereas Bruce Lee perseveres through all the struggles with his fists, the characters in John Woo's movies use a lot of guns, and victory is never achieved cleanly, if at all.
I surrender! I surrender! I'm innocent! I'll do anything, just arrest me! I'm guilty!
In his book, Hong Kong, Culture and the Politics of Disappearance, published in 1997, Abbas coined the term déjà disparu to describe the cultural attitudes of Hong Kong at the time. He defines it as the feeling that what is new and unique about the situation is always already gone, and we're left holding a handful of cliches or a cluster of memories of what has never been. He sees this as a core idea of Hong Kong New Wave films, which often engage with the idea of Hong Kong's cultural memories rather than the memories themselves. With John Woo's films, this memory is the memory of Bruce Lee, which he mixes with Western influences. Particularly American Westerns and noir films, and filmmakers like Martin Scorsese and Jean-Pierre Melville. Cross-cultural pollination is a key characteristic of many Hong Kong New Wave films, and this is no less true of The Killer.
He was Mickey Mouse. I'm Dumbo.
Just as Hong Kong's colonial past informs its globalized present, its movies sought inspiration from both East and West to define a unique Hong Kong cinematic language. Take this scene for example. Jeff and Jenny are hiding out in the house when Detective Lee comes to arrest them. But suddenly, a group of hitmen sent after Jeff ambush the house, forcing the killer and the detective to team up for survival. This scene perfectly demonstrates John Woo's synthesis of Eastern and Western filmmaking. As Jeff rolls on the ground dodging bullets, the film jump cuts through the action, a move straight from the French New Wave playbook. And as he sprays down his assailants with a submachine gun, the film pulls a slow zoom on his face, a famous technique of Chinese martial art films. This mixing of influences is a very Hong Kong trait. Some of the most popular restaurants here, in fact, are Cha Chung Tangs, which merge American diner food with Cantonese cuisine. By combining the hard-boiled and the wuxia, John Woo was able to define a completely new style of action, one full of explosions and slow-mo, that has come to influence so much of Hollywood action cinema today. But did this really mean that Hong Kong had found its cultural voice? In 2024, John Woo returned to The Killer, this time as a Hollywood remake. It might not be a surprise that in 1993, after becoming one of Hong Kong's biggest directors, he left the land of milk tea for the land of opportunity. Like many directors, he went to Hollywood seeking fame and fortune, and he found them. His films Mission Impossible 2 and Face Off became his biggest box office successes. This new version of The Killer feels familiar. Z, an assassin, takes her final job but finds herself in too deep when she blinds a local singer. She then falls into a cat-and-mouse game with a detective, which eventually leads them to team up against the greater evil of a drug trafficking ring. But whereas the original is full of localized set pieces that scream Hong Kong, the remake has very little that feels local. You see, the remake takes place in a modern Paris, stripping the plot of the context which it was previously immersed in. Take a look at this scene from the original, which turns the 2,000-year-old tradition of the Dragon Boat Festival into a riveting chase scene. Or this scene set in the now-closed Kai Tak Airport, where Jeff and Jenny jumps into a baggage carousel to avoid the police. In contrast, the remake set pieces, a church, a hospital, an office, all feels like generic locations designed simply for the characters to run around in. It doesn't even matter that it's set in Paris. It's a lot like Shakespeare's Othello, where Cyprus was simply used as a foreign backdrop for an unrelated plot. Even the film's central conflict was watered down to Hollywood-friendly ideas. The original's conflict takes place between local organizations, the Hong Kong Police Force and the Triads, and its bleak ending reflects the cultural attitudes of the time. In contrast, the remake deals with vague, international entities with no relation to the land and ends in victory that feels all but earned.
You deserve this death.
Everyone thought that the world would end in the year 2000. But the people of Hong Kong thought that day would come in 1997, when Hong Kong would be handed back to China. 600,000 people rushed to the airport, desperate to leave before the expiry date. Others, who didn't have the mobility to leave, held a collective breath, not knowing what lay in store. Of course, Hong Kong didn't collapse in 1997. In the years since, Hong Kong has become an international city, with an economy highly dependent on global trade. But the handover wasn't a smooth process either. As players like John Woo and Wong Kar Wai left the scene, its film industry suffered, losing local funding as well as international recognition. Hong Kong's cultural power took a nosedive, and the pressure coming in from Beijing of Chinese nationalism escalated. But the people persisted. The films of the Hong Kong New Wave are still influential today, and have cemented the notion of Hong Kong's identity beyond its status as a British colony or as a Chinese region. This defiance made its way into everyday life too. As early as 2003, protests and demonstrations sprung up in reaction to the Chinese government encroaching on Hong Kong's political freedoms, culminating in the Umbrella Movement of 2014, and the mass, decentralized protest movements of 2019 that gained international support. As these protests demonstrate, the people of Hong Kong are not content with being in between. The country seeks its own identity. As the legendary Frantz Fanon once wrote, "The fight for national culture means in the first place to fight for the liberation of the nation, that material keystone which makes the building of a culture possible." Thanks for watching, and please subscribe. If you like this video, you may like my analysis of why Pixar's Elemental gets racism wrong. Stay erudite.